Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's debate, Green Claims and Carbon Markets, a framework for transparency to support Europe's path to net zero. My name is Dave Keating. I'm a journalist based in Brussels, coming at you live from the Euractiv studios at the heart of the EU quarter. Now, we're just starting out with the EU's new term. If all goes according to plan in the next weeks, we'll have the new Commission taking office in December with new pieces of legislation. But we also have pending pieces of legislation that are now going to start up negotiations really as all the new lawmakers have finished with the confirmation hearings that we've been having over the past month. Now, the ambitious goal of the EU achieving net zero emissions by 2050 is still one of the guiding forces shaping the regulatory framework in the European Union. But another guiding force is now industrial competitiveness. We know that European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has made industrial competitiveness really the flagship word of her second term, and she's supposed to be coming out with an industrial strategy in the first 100 days of her new term. Now, leading up to that, we've already had the Draghi report on the EU's competitiveness, underscoring some of the problems that the EU is facing in that area. And President von der Leyen has promised to make her new term more attuned to industry than her first one, but also to make it the next step in the Green Deal, which was her signature policy achievement of the first term. Today, we're going to be talking about one of the first pieces of legislation that's being negotiated in the new term, and that's the Green Claims Directive. Specifically, we'll be talking about what might be the effects, intended or unintended, on voluntary carbon markets around the world. The GCD is set to be a cornerstone in enhancing transparency and integrity in green claims. And like much of EU legislation, it is bound to have a knock-on effect around the world. The idea is to combat greenwashing and provide consumers with reliable information. However, there's a concern that with some of the amendments that have been introduced in the European Parliament, the wording of the legislation could hinder the use of voluntary carbon markets, which have so far been able to mobilize significant private sector investment in climate action. But voluntary carbon markets haven't been popular with everyone, including with some MEPs in the Parliament. Some say they are a license to pollute, they represent a form of greenwashing in their own right. However, the proponents of such systems say that high-integrity carbon credits support valuable environmental projects that would not be funded otherwise, and they accelerate the overall transition to net zero. So, with the GCD soon entering interinstitutional negotiations between the Parliament and the Council, today's panel will discuss how it aligns with the EU's broader climate objectives and how voluntary carbon markets might be impacted. Let me introduce you now to the panelists we have here with us today to talk about this issue. We have here to my left Jennifer Jenkins, who is Chief Science Officer at Rubicon Carbon and co-chair of BACA, B-A-C-A, which we'll hear more about in a moment. We have Paul Muthara, who is CEO of the African Carbon Markets Initiative. We have Ana Ruiz, a policy analyst with the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. And we have Jacob Bourgeois, who's head of carbon strategies and innovation at Volkswagen Climate Partner. Thank you to all four of you for joining us today. Now, you in the audience, whether you're watching us online or out here in person with us, will be able to ask your questions to the panel using Slido. You see that QR code on the screen there. If you're here in the room, you can just scan that with your phone. If you're at home, you can type in your questions. I'll receive your questions here on my tablet, and I'll put them to the panelists at the end of the panel. You can go ahead and type in your questions now if you already know what they will be. It's great. It'll give me a heads up, and I can get to your question first off when we go to the Q&A portion. So Jennifer, let's start with you. I mentioned that BACA is recently founded. Tell us a little bit about why it was founded, and why do you believe that voluntary carbon markets should remain an important part of fighting climate change?
Yeah, no, thank you. Appreciate being here today, and it's an honor to share the stage with these distinguished panelists. So thanks to everyone for being here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. BACA stands for the Business Alliance for Climate Action, and we are a group of allied and aligned stakeholders stakeholders in the voluntary carbon market who got together, about a year ago and realized that, frankly, the negative media narrative around carbon markets seemed to be spilling over into the policy discussions. And so we were seeing there were a lot of proposals that were coming out that just really seemed destined to limit the impact of the voluntary carbon market. And so we decided that, as a group, we would get together and engage directly with policymakers in a way to sort of help work with people so that we could shape the rules and regulations and laws and proposals that were coming out in order to support the market, right, rather than hinder it. And we believe in a few key principles. We believe in quality. We believe in integrity. Transparency and disclosure are absolutely critical. We believe in all of the solutions and interoperability between voluntary markets and compliance markets. Now, to your question about why is the VCM so important, I've been at this for 30 years. Emissions are still going up. We've just hit another record, right? We're going to need at least $250 trillion in order to meet the net zero challenge by 2050. That's, for you guys keeping score at home, that's over $10 trillion a year. Where is that money going to come from? Is it going to come from governments? Probably not. With the conversation at COP29 is sort of evidence of that, right? Is it going to come from philanthropies, $10 trillion a year globally? Probably not. In order to meet the net zero challenge and fight the climate crisis, we're going to need the private sector to get involved. They're the ones that have the funding. And in order to make this happen, right, the voluntary carbon market is the best tool I know to bring funding and climate finance from places where money exists, which is in the private sector, to projects that have an important impact in all the different credit, sort of all the different project types around the world. And this is especially true when you think about, it's especially true when you think about funding in places like the Global South, where funding for climate positive actions is especially difficult to come by. So the voluntary carbon market is here. It exists. It's not perfect. It's a tool that we have today. The institutions and the policies already exist. And there are efforts underway to improve it and rectify the shortfalls that the media have been pointing out over the last 18 months or so. So I have great faith in the voluntary carbon market. I think it's a fantastic tool. It's a mechanism that we need in order to take the urgent action that we need in this critical decade.
Paul, Jennifer just mentioned that VCMs can be a good vehicle for providing financing for projects in the Global South. Do you see voluntary carbon markets as an important part of fighting climate change, specifically in the African context?
Thanks so much for that, Dave. I think for me, once again, just reiterating the appreciation to be part of this conversation, but just very strongly emphasizing that undoubtedly there's value in the voluntary carbon market space. But I think especially on the back of the last 2 years where we've seen prices coming down, a lot of adverse concerns around transparency and integrity, there is, as Jen has highlighted, great steps being taken by the key institutions in the VCM space to build greater transparency, accountability, and integrity in the way these things are structured and claims are laid. But as we move in that direction, I think we are conscious that when you're talking about $250 trillion, that kind of scale of numbers ties back to the core question you need to answer around the real price of carbon. Because until we have the right incentive for behavioral change, we'll not see the huge flows of capital that need to move into this space to really unlock solutions and really allow for meaningful transformations. When you look at the African continent, I think we're very conscious that as you look at a cross-section of projects, it's very evident just the scale of the social and economic, they say co-benefits, but it's like primary benefits that are attached to these projects, that they really transform the lives, the environments around them. And then almost the co-benefit is the CO2 reduction and emissions reduction numbers. But if we're able to really better kind of contextualize those social and economic impacts in the valuation of these projects. It then starts really coming back to the meaningful, correct pricing of carbon that can really catalyze behavioral change, as well as really fuel green growth and economic transformation in these spaces, allowing for meaningful manufacturing industrial transitions.
Anna, you've been studying the policy around this, and specifically with the Green Claims Directive. Tell us a little bit about how the Green Claims Directive could impact voluntary carbon markets.
Thank you. Is the mic okay? Yeah? Okay. Thank you so much for the question. I will share a bit of reflections on that. You did a great overview of the Green Claims Directive in the beginning, but taking a step back.
Sorry to interrupt you. We do need to fix your microphone,
Yeah.
I'm being told. So let's go to Jacob first. Someone's going to fix your mic, and then we'll come back to you. Jacob, as I mentioned, you're with Volkswagen Climate Partners, so you're working with companies on their net zero goals. How important are voluntary carbon markets for corporate strategies in general?
Yeah, good. Thanks for the invitation. Sorry, and I'll stay out of your way while we get the microphone fixed. The voluntary carbon markets, I would put it that it can be important, but the importance is very fragile. And I think we're seeing that over the last few years, how fragile that can be without the right institutional frameworks and kind of public support or public trust. The use case, I think, has evolved over time, and that kind of defines how important the VCMs have played in corporate sustainability strategies, offsetting strategies, generally speaking, how they interact with the compliance markets. I think it's clear that after the passage of the Paris Agreement in 2016, there was kind of wide open spaces for understanding that there was an aspiration for net zero in 2050 without really an idea of how companies and even countries, everyone will admit this, we don't really know how to get there yet. It's an aspiration. It'll be a discovery process along the way of how exactly you go about the mitigation hierarchy, what it'll cost, what mechanisms you use. I think there was kind of a landscape of possibilities possible at that time, and there was a broad recognition that the VCMs would play a critical role. I think, as Jen said, as kind of one tool among many in supporting that transition, especially as a bridge mechanism in the early days. Before really the institutional frameworks were available to provide the other tools sufficient time and funding to really get where they needed to be to essentially decarbonize, which I think is what in the end has to happen for all companies. But in the initial years, I think the challenge is really figuring out how you actually get to that place first. So there was a recognition that the VCM was a powerful tool for that. It could provide mitigation potential at scale, at cost potentially. But I think it's already been mentioned a few times, there's challenges with that. Obviously, we had reputational hits that the market took, centered on specific intervention types in particular, but I think it affected the whole market in general. And then you have legislation emerging, not just in the EU, but I'm speaking on behalf of a global company. The regulatory environment is really operating at different speeds and different intensities in various jurisdictions around the world. And I think that's really challenged the initial conception of the use case of what the VCM would be. Maybe hasn't resulted in a retreat, but maybe a stalling as people kind of wait and see exactly how this is going to evolve. So I think the challenge, especially for us now being a German-based company, is just seeing, okay, what use case still remains? Will some of those criticisms be repaired? And ultimately, how exactly will VCMs be used in the future? I think we're seeing kind of differentiated ideas within the Volkswagen Group, but also our shareholders generally speaking about exactly what can be used. I tend to see more traction and support where the VCM can be used as a complementary measure with other policy tools that do exist. For example, you have tax obligations in certain countries. Sometimes the VCM can support that as a cheaper mitigation option. Other times it can be used to address certain Scope 3 emission reductions that are still very tricky and no one really has figured out how to address yet. But whether that's possible or not is another question. So I think having that bridge solution available is kind of the critical component and would make it a very important, crucial component of any sustainability strategy, decarbonization strategy moving forward. But until that's crystal clear, we're sort of in a waiting period. And I think us especially, we're essentially investors for our shareholders within the Volkswagen Group and Climate Partner. And projects take years to develop, and kind of anticipating where the market will be, what the use case will be several years from now is is tricky, and it's hard to keep engagement when there's lack of clarity on that.
Well, Anna, let's go back to you on the specifics of the Green Claims Directive. So how are you expecting the GCD to impact voluntary carbon markets?
So indeed, great overview in the beginning. The GCD, the proposed Green Claims Directive, intends to establish minimum requirements on the substantiation and communication of environmental claims. These explicit environmental claims are made on a voluntary basis in business-to-consumer practices. Within these environmental claims, the directive explicitly addresses and includes in the scope climate-related claims based on carbon credits, which, as we know, are issued in voluntary carbon markets. But it's important to take this step back and to understand that this requirement to substantiate environmental claims in general, already existed in the general EU consumer law under the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive. But this directive didn't explicitly state what companies, what corporations should do, which information should provide to substantiate these claims, and for these claims to not to be considered misleading in any way, because the Commission did this study finding that more than 50% of the claims were misleading or didn't have enough information for you to understand the claim that was being made or to prove that the claim was true or false. So rather than being misleading itself, they noticed that information lacked. So the European Commission put it forward this proposal, and specifically concerning climate-related claims based on carbon credits. The Commission text foresees the need of the substantiation assessment to include and separate the offsets from the other greenhouse gas emissions. Secondly, to specify whether these offsets concern emission reductions or removals. And thirdly, describe how these offsets are of high integrity and accounted for correctly. This being said, and since the ultimate goal of the GCD is to concomitantly protect consumers from misleading environmental claims and also business from unfair commercial practice, in theory, the directive should have a positive impact in the sense that brings transparency, brings confidence to both players in their purchase options. Nevertheless, as you mentioned in the beginning, the Parliament and the Council the co-legislators have their texts. Specifically, essentially, the European Parliament introduced several restrictions. I think we will further talk and develop that, but one of the main is restricting these offset claims and compensation claims. They use the term compensation claims only to residual emissions. And in this sense, if a more restrictive approach of the directive and the text prevails, indeed, this will have an impact on voluntary carbon markets. Indirectly, inadvertently, because we are talking, of course, about marketing and about public claiming of voluntary claims. But of course, this is an incentive for companies. So indeed, there's a spectrum of possibilities between claiming only that the company is carbon neutral based only and exclusively in offsets or using them for residual emissions. There's a spectrum that can play a role in companies' decarbonisation strategy. Yeah.
So Jennifer, as we've just heard from Anna there, so the key question we're talking about here are some amendments introduced by the European Parliament, specifically around compensation claims or contribution claims, possibly limiting only to residual emissions. So this would impact the way that VCMs and their participants can be marketed, right? Tell us what specifically would be the impact on VCMs, and why would an inability to market their activity in VCMs hurt the VCM activity itself?
Yeah. The key, I mean, there are a lot of things to unpack in there. Certainly the difference between compensation and contribution claims, and I can talk about that, I think, but your question is more about the incentives, right? And why is it important for companies to be able to make a claim at all, right? And I want you to just kind of put yourself in the shoes of a CEO in the boardroom. Okay, you're CEO and you've got a sustainability officer, and they're saying, we've got this net zero target. You've got to, it's a voluntary target. You're going to have to, invest in, you're going to have to do a lot of things in your operations to, decarbonize and do all the things that you need to do in order to reduce your emissions. Okay, so the CEO is on board. Great, perfect. A lot of decarbonization options. We get to the point where the next least expensive decarbonization option is simply too expensive. It's going to put the company out of business, right? So the CEO in the boardroom says, this is a voluntary target, right? I have a choice. I can bankrupt my company, or I could maybe buy a few carbon credits, which are much less expensive, in order to meet my target, or I could just choose to miss my target, right? And missing the target, if you know anything about business, is also kind of not an option. So the company has a choice, right? They can just walk away, right? But if they want to, the other option that they have is to invest, right, and put some funding toward a carbon project that might be outside its value chain. But they're going to need something in return for that, right? The board isn't just going to say, sure, let's go ahead and, we're going to miss our target, but buy some credits, and you don't get to say anything about it. You just sort of miss your target, and there needs to be something that the company gets in return for making that investment, right? And so the claim is kind of what the company can get in return for making the investment. Now, we can be 100% transparent about the claim. We don't have to mislead people and say, look, we reduced our internal value chain emissions and now we're carbon neutral, because that isn't what's happened, right? Maybe what you say is, we made it, 95% of the way to our target, and then we bought 5% in credits, and now we are, through the miracle of carbon credits, we are now saying that we are carbon neutral, right? I'm not trying to suggest that companies sort of push that under the rug, right? That would be greenwashing. But in a transparent way, I think we can find a way to allow and encourage companies to make these important investments while also protecting consumers from misleading claims.
Well, Jacob, in your experience working with companies, do you think that there wouldn't be an incentive to do this without being able to market it, without being able to make the claim? Does that jibe with your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It does. I just think the scope and the scale of action does depend on the kind of claim that you can make. So I think there is a broad recognition that there's a variety of claim possibilities out there. There has to be more transparency. I mean, obviously, a company that's still very early in its decarbonization journey isn't simply carbon neutral because it bought a bunch of offsets somewhere. I mean, I think there's recognition from most companies that that's inappropriate. But I think what you get back for it does vary, and it does depend on what you can do with it. So I think this kind of, to get back to your earlier question, I think also what Anna was mentioning about, compensation versus contribution claims, versus something else entirely, maybe just CSR marketing activity or kind of community sponsorship activities, or there's lots of other claims that can be made. I think just the distinction and the importance of using the compensation claim initially in the configuration around Paris Agreement, decarbonisation, science-based targets, the decarbonization pathway, all of this was that you wanted to match ton for ton. And I think that was really going to drive the volume and engagement with the market at a very high level. And that's where you saw a lot of these expectations and kind of early projections of what the market will grow exponentially over a certain number of years as soon as we figure out the integrity and claims issues. But once you de-link it from the tonnage and you're talking about compensation, or contributions, or maybe community sponsorships or mitigation activities supporting certain innovative technologies or something like that, you might fundamentally be dealing with different volumes at that point, different investment amounts. And I guess that's the challenge, is trying to see, okay, once you've moved away from compensation, how do you keep the same level of engagement? That's what gets tricky. So far, I think we don't have a great answer for that, besides that companies should do that. But again, if you can't really link it to something, how do you get there?
Just to kind of bring it back, I think if a company is sort of brave enough and ambitious enough to set a net zero target, I guess first of all, they're not going to be that brave and ambitious unless they know there's a number of pathways they can take to meet that target. Again, putting yourself back in the boardroom, you're a CEO. Do I make a target, or do I set a target or not? I happen to know, maybe I'm a company that makes steel or cement, and there really aren't that many, if any, sort of easily accessible, scalable decarbonization options out there for me. It would be madness for me to set an internal decarbonization target knowing that I simply won't be able to meet it, right? So, and that's just one example, but many other companies out there, what they need is flexibility. They need the option. If they're going to set these long-term targets, they need to know that there's a way in the end for them to meet that target without putting themselves out of business. And sort of the VCM, I think, is an important sort of way for companies to get that kind of flexibility in terms of meeting their targets, and that's going to encourage them in the first place to even set them.
Just building on that, Jen, when we look at the fundamentals of the credit space being about incentivizing progressive reduction of emissions, unless you have you feel the pinch that comes in offsets, how are you really continuously incentivizing continuous innovation on the decarbonization story? I think when you look at how much the whole space has evolved over the last 10 years, there's huge amounts that can happen when people double down on it. But if they don't have a sufficient incentive to double down, it may slow down that transition. So, and I think that's why I come back to the point on, we do need to really make sure there's an appropriate pricing of this credit space, so that yes, you can buy the credits as you wait for an evolution of your emissions reduction processes, but you need to keep being pushed to apply energies and resources to that reduction. So you don't just get locked in this loop of just buying the credits and staying where you are.
Anna, can you explain to us why the distinction between contribution and compensation claims is important? And also, is there a difference between some of the provisions in the GCD that would simply require transparency, as Jennifer is laying out, showing that we did 95% with our own emissions, 5% with offsets, versus something? What's the specific language that would make a company unable to say anything about that 5%?
As I mentioned in the beginning, the Commission proposal doesn't do that. Doesn't include in that in the text the wording and the distinction between contribution and compensation claims. This distinction was introduced by the European Parliament, although they do not define the terms in Article 2, which includes the definitions of specific legal terms used in the directive. I think also Jennifer can enter and contribute on that, because these terms were also long used in voluntary carbon markets. But then the Council, the general approach, also includes the distinction. It includes contribution claims, but changes the name of compensation claim to offset claim. Offset claims are basically when you use carbon credits to compensate your emissions reductions, and the contribution claim here. It's a financial contribution that you can claim, you can marketing, but you cannot use it to counterbalance emissions, or to, as the European Parliament uses the words, you cannot claim that to show a positive impact on the product or the trader, an environmental climate impact. I don't know if any of the speakers can elaborate on that, but
yeah, I can. I think if you think about, and I'll use sort of a visual. Hopefully, I'm going to talk with my hands, so hopefully you can understand what I'm saying. So if you imagine your company is, your emissions, in year one are here, and you've set a target, and your target is here, right? So this is your sort of emissions reduction line. This is your target right here. Okay, imagine a target line. So there's a couple of ways to think about how to make a claim. The VCMI, or the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, which is a new sort of NGO in this space, has created what they call a carbon integrity claim. And in order to earn a carbon integrity claim, what a company needs to do is purchase enough credits, basically purchase credits in an equivalent amount to their annual unabated emissions. And they get different sort of levels of claims, different labels based on what proportion of their unabated emissions they've sort of covered with credits. The highest claim is called a platinum claim, and you can earn that claim if you purchase credits that amount to 100% or more of your annual unabated emissions. Okay, so that happens to be exactly the same approach that the ISO 14068 carbon neutrality standard also takes, right? Which is basically your company can be carbon neutral you can make a carbon neutral claim if you purchase credits in an equivalent amount to your annual unabated emissions. So that's a claim. And I think whether that's a compensation claim or a contribution claim is that is vague and unclear. And different people have different views on that. Okay. So that's sort of the carbon neutrality view of the world. One second, sorry. The other view of the world is here's your target line, and but your annual emissions are here, and you're working really hard to decarbonize, and maybe you had a plan, and your plan was upset by something. It was delayed. Maybe there was a permit that you couldn't get, or technology was more expensive than you had thought it would be, and so you couldn't actually decarbonize all the way down to your target line. Okay, in that case, you can purchase, the other use case for credits is to purchase credits basically just for the delta, right, between sort of where you are today and what your target is, right? And that is the sort of typical standard use of a compensation claim, right? You should have been at the target, you missed it, and so you have to buy credits for the delta. Like that is the very sort of standard, typical, traditional, word for the compensation claim. VCMI is also sort of considering allowing limited use of credits to make a compensation claim like that for companies in their Scope 3 emissions only. And there's all kinds of details. They've limited it to less than 25% of your Scope 3 emissions, and there's a sunset on it. You can only do that out to 2038. Et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of the state of play today on the compensation claim side. A contribution claim is typically used, it's sort of just another word for you can buy these credits, but you don't get to say anything about your corporate emissions based on them, right? So that's, in a way, it's sort of it's a contribution to the global good. And that's sort of why, that's why it's called a contribution claim. Our view is that in order to provide the kind of incentives that companies need to really get involved and invest heavily, we're not really going to build and scale impact based on philanthropy alone. And so there needs to be some kind of thing, some sort of statement that a company can make based on its progress toward net zero, consistent with the mitigation hierarchy, right? Nobody is saying we shouldn't internally decarbonize first, right? We need to make all those investments in internal decarbonization. And so that's the compensation and contribution claim thing. Basically, we need all the claims. I'm not going to try to tell people that they shouldn't use a contribution claim. Fine, if somebody wants to use a contribution claim, great, go for it. But that shouldn't be the only kind of claim we offer, because we really need to provide incentives for companies to get involved. They need to have a reason to engage.
Well, just building on that very point, is there room, even when we come back to the claims directive, for it to build in much clearer definitions, what's a substantiated and unsubstantiated claim? So you start kind of leveraging the lessons learned from the CCPs coming from VCMI in terms of how exactly to build sufficient clarity and transparency on what you're doing, what impact it's having, and even the life cycle of what you're investing in. So you can have a much clearer picture of what you're actually putting money towards and the long-term impact you're having.
Right, and so that's about transparency, right? Substantiating that claim. But you brought, I'm sorry for taking so much airtime, you brought up the ICVCM and the core carbon principles. So that's another important, the ICVCM, for those who may be unfamiliar, is the Integrity Council on the Voluntary Carbon Market, and that's sort of the companion to the VCMI that I described earlier. The ICVCM is on the supply side, and it's doing a really good job at setting the bar around quality, right? So that a credit or a methodology that has a credit that has been created with a methodology that has been tagged by the ICVCM as being consistent with what is called its core carbon principles is good, right? And so that is a really important step in the direction of consistent high quality for the carbon market overall.
Jacob, for the MEPs who have introduced these amendments, we know that, as Jennifer mentioned, there have been negative media reports. We know that there have been some abuses, and this is likely what they're responding to. So when people, point at VCMs and say, look, this is greenwashing, I think, most people could understand some of the situation that Jennifer's outlining here, where you just need to make up for a target that wasn't reached. But how would you respond to those who would say, that the whole idea of offsetting is too open to abuse by companies, particularly when they're looking to market?
Yeah, I'm not totally averse to the criticism. I think there's always, I haven't been doing this as long as Jennifer, but I've been kind of 13 years in the voluntary carbon market as well. For some time here, played a variety of different roles. I've worked for standards, I've worked for project developers, I've worked for investors, I've worked for VVBs. There's always been criticism of the markets in the voluntary carbon market and just market mechanisms in general when it comes to environmental commodities. I think that's something that's ever present. I think many of the criticisms are valid. This is a little bit different from a typical product that we deal with. It is based around a claim and kind of a climate compensation concept that does require a certain degree of quality and oversight to deal with some of the integrity issues that are out there. So I don't think the criticisms are entirely unfounded. I just think, when I think of the integrity issue and when I think of the fundamental demand issue that we see in the market, it's not really all around integrity and quality. I think many of the voluntary carbon market players are kind of falling back on, if we only make the credits robust enough and high integrity enough, the demand will come. But I see the lack of demand as the main issue, and it's coming from other things. I mean, around the claims issue, for example, and kind of political action and regulatory certainty, and kind of what you can do with these credits in a long-term pathway, or as a bridge solution, or whatever it needs to be. And I think kind of left to themselves, the voluntary carbon market isn't really going to fix this on their own. They do need a regulatory infrastructure and support from public authorities and regulation, frankly, to build trust. And I think if done correctly, and we see this in many markets around the world, I mean, offsets don't just exist in the voluntary carbon market. Offsets are used in various compliance markets around the world. There's always been criticism, but I think history has shown that if you have a solid underpinning of regulatory quality that addresses integrity, that addresses safeguards, that addresses community concerns, if done correctly, the trust will come with time. And you see a lot less criticism often of those markets than you do with the voluntary carbon market. So I think often we're jumping through hoops, I think, to try to please everybody. And that's not really getting at, I mean, addressing that would be great. And I think, the standards, the rating agencies, the developers, we've all really had to up our game over the last decade, I think. And I think we're doing quite a good job with that. There's a long way to go. I think there's a lot of kind of issues that still exist in the voluntary carbon market and other markets. Maybe we can get through to some of those issues later, but that's all there and that's evolving. But I think that the regulatory side is really where I think we would see the support that we need to kind of build that trust. And I think the trust will come if you do this.
Can I comment on that? It's such a good point, right, about all the different reasons why demand is lacking. And I love your sort of making the leap to other, it's not even a leap, just making the connection, right, to other markets. I think right, so one of the problems that we have right now, a company, it's hard because of all the negative media attention, a company is afraid to get involved because they're afraid of headline risk. Right? They don't want to invest in the wrong project because 5 years down the road, it could be exposed as having some issue with it, right? Well, let's think about what happens in the bond market, right? Let's say you invest in a bond and the company has, the bond becomes impaired for some reason. Okay, the bond is impaired. Maybe now it's worth a little bit less than it was worth before, but it's not worthless. Right? There's still some value there. What we do in the bond market is we repackage it, we rate it, we might sort of turn it into something else. We turn it into we repackage it and we make it into another. We sort of transparently rate it and offer it to someone else who maybe has a different risk tolerance. Right? So it doesn't just go away, right? We don't just say, well, bonds are bad, right? Okay, well, that bond was bad, so clearly bonds stink and nobody should ever invest in or make another bond, right? So I think that's the problem that we have in this market. It's still so small, and we're still so sensitive to that kind of criticism. We haven't sort of grown up into a more sort of financialized, mature market where we recognize there is risk in every project. There is always going to be risk.
I just want to put to Anna, can the Green Claims Directive help the voluntary carbon markets, help the confidence in them and the price by clearly establishing a difference between a substantiated claim and an unsubstantiated claim?
I think yes, if well designed. I don't think the purpose of the Green Claims Directive is to regulate voluntary carbon markets. This falls necessarily outside the scope of the directive. And even though, yes, corporate climate claims depend necessarily, the accuracy of these claims depend necessarily of the quality of the credits and the environmental integrity of the credits. This falls necessarily outside of the scope of the directive. And but this being said, it can have a positive impact if, again, addresses climate-related claims, provides that the substantiation assessment shall include this information and that information. Again, as Jennifer said, very in accordance to VCMI, the good practice code, etc., which I know they are in contact with the Commission to make everything works. So it can signal a positive evolution, even though the purpose is not neither to create impediments, neither to boost voluntary carbon markets, because it's a very broad scope. So again, maybe we should have a specific public signal on the incentives to voluntary carbon markets, because yes, with time we will get there, but there's no time. So indeed, corporations will end to avoid this scrutiny, to avoid these risks, long-term risk, permanence, monitoring, reporting, etc. Will drop and will not engage with corporate sustainability, and this would be also a signal against some development in some member states. For instance, in Portugal, we recently adopted a law creating the voluntary carbon market and providing some rules for the functioning of the projects taking place there, with some guiding principles according to all the international standards and experience. Also in Finland, the government also issued a report on the voluntary carbon actions and the role of international carbon markets. So we see that governments are seeing the potential of these, and having here a more restrictive approach from the Green Claims Directive would be counterproductive or mixed signals. Yeah.
No, I think it's just building on Anna's point. It's also making sure that as we see that progressive evolution in the detail of the Green Claims Directive, how do we also make sure that it's not obstructing the legitimate use of high integrity, high quality credits? Because as entities are really building climate strategies, you need to complement your actions around direct emissions reduction with other components, mechanisms to really address your progress going forward. So it's really just making sure that as we're building the detail in the directive, it is not blocking out growth of this space. Because when you look at the Africa space, when you look at the realities of the high renewable energy potential, the low emissions transition costs, the high employment capacity on this continent, and the robust, very strong natural resources and assets, how do we make sure that we're not blocking off the generation of credits as a solid economic activity for jobs creation and really economic evolution from ever coming to be? Making sure that there are appropriate, transparent incentives around appropriate and equitable pricing, making sure there's clear accountability on revenue allocation across the value streams, to make sure, especially when you look at nature-based, the communities that are most affected or most involved in those projects are being adequately compensated and participating in the benefits of the flow of that.
Well, when we're thinking about the beneficiaries of these projects, Jennifer, let's imagine a scenario where the GCD gets passed in a way that makes VCMs just totally unappealing for companies, and they fall by the wayside. What's the tangible repercussions of that?
A planet on fire. I mean, I guess it sounds like what you're asking is, what if the Green Claims Directive kills the VCM? Well, I think we would have a lot less climate action than in the alternative case, which I think would be, devastating for the planet, I guess. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Paul, when we're thinking particularly about projects in the Global South, what would be the consequence of not having the money from VCMs available?
And it builds into even the current significant shift you're seeing to a focus on removals, sometimes the detriment of reductions and avoidance as an opportunity, where you have an environment on the continent where there's huge upside and impact from rolling out new infrastructure, new manufacturing institutions, capacity that could really drive the reductions and avoidance realities. But it's not being, sometimes doesn't feel like it's being incentivized or recognized as the way forward. And an undue focus on just only removals, if anything, increases in emissions to focus on those removals. How do we keep those emissions from ever occurring in the first place? Through reductions and reductions approaches. But taking away that, I think one of the key points we're really trying to advocate as ACMI is, as we continue this conversation on the Africa-European alignment and correlation, how are we building clear understanding and co-beneficiary structures in the way the market infrastructure are operational, so that there can be a mutual benefit and participation in delivering solutions, as opposed to catalyzing and scaling up the problem.
Jacob, you wanted to come in?
Yeah. Maybe just to speak from the private sector side, so from the demand side, as to your question of what would happen if the VCM just went away. I mean, I just see a few options. I mean, one would be we would fall back to this contribution claim or CSR kind of claims, which I was speaking about that before, that it's essentially the same thing, but just at a vastly lower scale than the current investment we're seeing, and vastly less than what we need as part of the green energy transition, the green economy transition. That would be one alternative. Another would be to focus more exclusively on compliance markets, which I think to some extent that's where the world is going anyway. Problem with that being, I mean, Anna mentioned a few of these, there's a few others that are emerging around the world. Issue with that only being that it's occurring, but at a very slow pace, and usually in advanced economies first, and not necessarily where you have scalable mitigation potential at a lower cost, which you would have in many sub-Saharan African countries, for example, or in Latin America, or many other places around the world. So, I mean, there again, it would be a slow process, probably a more robust process in the long term. That might be where the VCM is going anyway, but we would just need time to get there, and we don't have time. And the last alternative, if neither of those are really an option, would simply be that companies focus on decarbonization, but I think talked about that before as well. That's not happening at the speed that it needs to happen. It's lumpy. It's subject to budget cycles, downturns. There's a lot of, geopolitical developments around the world that are affecting this pathway. I think it's going to be a lot of up and down over the world. And then, I mean, unless you're a large multinational corporation like the VW Group is, I mean, then you would be engaging in decarbonization efforts in various countries around the world, but it would still be very much an insider's game. You'd be focusing on sort of the manufacturing processes and maybe the energy infrastructure, which is all great, but again, not at the scale that it needs to occur. And even if you decarbonize, emissions are occurring anyway, so not compensating for those somehow or addressing those somehow is leaving money on the table. And then, I mean, for much of the kind of Western world, you would be focusing on maybe Europe and North America, which is fine, but again, it's kind of geographically limited compared to the scale of the action that we need to see. So I would see it kind of going in one of those directions.
Okay, well, I want to take some questions that have come in from the audience now. I'm going to start with some questions that are more skeptical about VCMs. So first question is for Jennifer. So it comes from Margot Legalou from ECOS. Surveys have shown that consumers misunderstand offsetting claims, leading to greenwashing. How should companies communicate buying credits to ensure that consumers understand that credits are not emission reductions in their own value chain, but that these are indeed offsets? What's the best way to communicate that?
Yeah, I think I gave an example earlier, right? Transparency is critical, I think, and I think a company, based on the language they use, can very clearly explain what proportion of their target was met using internal decarbonization. They can even talk about what internal decarbonization steps they did, right, in their annual sustainability report. And then they should say clearly, did they meet the target? Did they not meet the target? If they believe they met the target, then what proportion of that, what proportion of their sort of claim is based on whatever value chain action they did, and what proportion of that claim is based on, purchasing credits. And they should also talk about which credits they bought and how, there are lots of examples out there of companies that are doing a really good job of, transparently describing, their targets and how they've been meeting them.
Next question is for Anna. So this question is from Pia Stoll. It's a bit of a technical question. How can credits registered in the EU's CRCF carbon market, today adopted by the Council, be used for green claims, or is that market not a VCM? So is that related to VCMs or not?
No, indeed, the Parliament, the European Parliament version text restricts as well compensation claims, offset claims, using credit units certified under the carbon removal, carbon farming, change the name, yeah, CRCF regulation or equivalent. Indeed, if they use these would be kind of a restriction. There's still no methodologies under CRCF, as far as I know. It was adopted indeed, but everything else, the methodologies are still being developed. But the idea is that these methodologies reflect the other methodologies that are out there already and are considered good in the sense of the EU parameter and of integrity, and according to IC VCM and VCMI. But the idea is for this Green Claims Directive proposal to be linked with CRCF, to be linked with CSRD, to be linked with the other European regulations and strategies that are relevant for current credits and for transparency and for the decarbonization to achieve the European law targets and the Paris Agreement. So everything should be pieced together.
Next audience question I'm going to put to Paul. This question is from Frédéric Simon from Carbon Pulse. If you could rewrite the EU's Green Claims Directive, what would you put in it that, in your view, would stimulate the voluntary carbon market? So we talked before with Anna, that's of course not the objective of the GCD, but if you could design it in a way that actually helps VCMs, how would you do it?
I think, as we've said, I think start with much clearer and tighter definitions of substantiated and unsubstantiated, so we can really start building, unpacking the complexity that's built into current verification, really seeing how we can more strongly mandate, third-party verification, and really looking fundamentally at the allowing for comprehensive assessment of the overall life cycle of the impact to really evaluate effectiveness in the long term, and really catalyze really just transparent and detailed guidelines around supporting documentation, so that everyone across the ecosystem knows what's going to be necessary to get the job done. But I think if I could just add one added point, is just really to your earlier point around impact and implications for the continent. I think when you look at the huge social and economic benefits that tend to flow out with projects on the continent that substantially often crowd out the CO2 reductions or removals impact. That firing engine for really transforming communities, impacting lifestyles, livelihoods, if that's really not being catalyzed, and we're not really looking at credit generation as an economic opportunity. Economic opportunity created the problem. So how are we building economic opportunity to support the solution in addressing this? Yeah.
Next question I want to put to Jacob. It really, I think, goes to the heart of the transparency issue that we're talking about here. It's from Margot Legalou at ECOS. How can we ensure that the low cost of carbon credits doesn't deter companies from funding emission reductions in their own value chain, using credits as an easier way out? So we talked about the circumstance where a company just needs to go that little extra mile. What if it's tempting to a company to just do the whole thing? Is transparency enough, given that a previous questioner said that consumers don't really understand what they're reading about these market declarations? How do we prevent that from happening?
Yeah, no, very good question. I mean, I think no one's quite figured that out yet, but I think we put a lot of steps in place to try to address this. I think everything that's been happening for the last 10 years, you know, in terms of the net zero pathway, decarbonize first, the taxonomy, just having all of these steps in place before you compensate for residual emissions, or just not simply claiming carbon neutrality without anything else happening at the sustainability strategy level. I think that's all becoming more embedded in the corporate culture. Everyone kind of understands this. I mean, and again, even at their kind of most sinister, if you want to put it that way, carbon offsets were always seen as a bridging solution to internal decarbonization, which is always kind of the end goal anyway. You know, and all kind of mitigation actions out there, CORSIA, SBTI, net zero guidance, Oxford offsetting principles, everything that we kind of point to as a North Star, Article 6 negotiations in the Paris Agreement, this is all pointing in the same direction, which is exactly how to avoid this problem, that you just don't simply go for the lowest cost credits, the cheapest credits, you don't decarbonize at all. So I think that there's sort of an understanding of this at the corporate level, and everyone recognizes that that's what needs to happen. I think that the tricky part is translating that to the consumer level, where they really understand that that's actually what's happening, and communicating it in a simple and effective way becomes tricky. I mean, what I would say is that actually offsets are there to provide a cheaper mitigation action as opposed to direct decarbonization. If you're operating in the global north and your mitigation cost is, I don't know, at $100 per ton, but then you can, purchase a credit that's a fraction of that. It's an economically efficient solution. That was always kind of the market solution idea that was proposed. Again, I think we've gotten away from that and towards a better framework for thinking about decarbonization and how mitigation fits in with that from a carbon markets perspective. But I think that option should be there, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. You just want to make sure it's embedded in a robust system that's going in the right direction. As for how to make that very crystal clear to the end consumer, that's what I think I'm kind of still waiting to see an elegant solution for that. And I think it's a lot of it's just a communications issue. How do you communicate that transparently, effectively, and simply in a way that's understandable for the end consumer to make sure that they understand that that's what you're doing and you're not just going out and buying junk credits, as some journalists will say. So I think that's still a work in progress. I'm hoping this legislation helps with that. Again, I think a regulatory framework from states at the national level would really help towards alleviating some of those concerns, even if it means focusing on kind of a narrower segment of the market that's lower risk. I mean, there's lots of solutions out there that I see to kind of fix that. But I think kind of the question of how do companies avoid that, they're already avoiding it. They just don't really know exactly how to about doing it and what exactly they can say about it. That's the challenge I see.
Anna, the next question is directed to you. You're getting all the technical questions, sorry about that. So the question is from Anya Juraj. Do you think that the today agreed upon Danish carbon tax could have an impact on carbon markets, especially agriculture-related ones? I'm not familiar with this, are you?
No, I'm sorry. First, I don't follow specifically the legislative procedure, but and I don't follow the file of agriculture either. It's my colleague Juan, but I can get back to to the person if she can email me, and I will forward it to Juan, which deals with agriculture and ETS and current pricing and tax. So it would be more efficient, yes.
Sorry, Anna, you're more up to speed than we are. We have to look into that. All right, next question I'll put to Jennifer. The question is from Elena Maro. Do you think that the Council general approach is the right approach to regulate the claims? Could the text drafted by the Council be striking the right balance between preventing greenwashing and not negatively impacting the VCM?
In a nutshell, I guess, and to speak in a nutshell, also to speak broadly, the Commission version was flexible and helpful, right? And it understood, it sort of supported the market and supported its growth. The Parliament version was much more restrictive. It included a restriction on using credits only for residual emissions, only using permanent removals to compensate for those residual emissions. And it didn't really define residual. And it included, it was much more limited. The Council version expanded it a little bit, but I don't think it widened the aperture quite enough, right? There are pieces in the Council version that we would still sort of push back on. And I think just specifically, we're interested in flexibility. We're interested in all the different kinds of claims. We're interested in, also transparency. And let me, I want to speak to the sort of question that that you asked Jacob earlier, which was how do we prevent companies from just sort of buying cheap offsets instead of internally decarbonizing, right? In other words, how do we prevent companies from not following the mitigation hierarchy, right? Because the mitigation hierarchy says you first internally decarbonize. And I think this came up today earlier in some conversations we were having. I think we have an opportunity here because in the Green Claims Directive, why wouldn't we establish safeguards that required a certain amount of, maybe there's two targets. Maybe there's an internal decarbonization target, and then there's sort of an optional target where you could, more flexibility. That's just one choice. I'm not espousing any one particular solution, but I do feel like there has to be a way for us to establish safeguards such that that doesn't happen, right? Let's not throw the entire carbon market out because we're worried that one or two, that a subset of companies might use it as an easy pathway. I think that's the wrong answer.
Anna, I want to put that question about the Council's approach to you as well, whether you think it makes sense. And a second related question here from Victoria. Do you have any insight on the timeline of the GCD? Last update I got, I think trilogue negotiations aren't starting until January. Is that the case?
I think there's probably no official position, but yes, everything indicates that it will start next year, and probably with the next presidency, not the Hungarian presidency, but with the Polish presidency. So it might have here the trilogues will be delayed a bit. A couple of months, but I've heard the Commission is ready to start the negotiations, so I think everything is ready. So it can be whenever.
When they do start the negotiations, the Council approach, better approach?
The Council approach, as Jennifer mentioned, drops these more restrictive. Rules, drops the mention to residual emissions, drops the mention to corresponding adjustment that were in interim versions of the compromise text, but keeps the distinction between a contribution offset claim and contribution claim. and also introduces a cross-reference to CSRD and the need for a company to make an offset claim and substantiate the offset claim. The trader needs to show that they establish a net zero target according to CSRD. And if we look at CSRD, there's lack of clarity of what is this net zero target. We look at the definition, and this may imply that the net zero target will actually requires a company to have a 95% reduction target, which kind of be also a more subtle or indirect restriction here.
Jacob, another question to you from Frederick Simon at Carbon Pulse. I'm not sure if you can answer this specifically, maybe you can answer more generally. The question is, how many credits has Volkswagen purchased so far on the VCM, and how much is it planning to purchase in the coming year? What incentive could the Green Claims Directive provide in this regard?
Yeah, so I can't speak on behalf of the Volkswagen Group directly on number of credits and prices paid and so on. I mean, this is kind of happening at the end client stage. Again, we support the investment of new projects and their portfolio guidance and kind of steering portfolios long term. So that's really where I'm involved. In terms of engagement, I mean, I think, again, I would kind of point to the different claims options that can be used. And this is really guiding, I think, how the different brands within the Volkswagen Group and also in Climate Partner, our other shareholder, are really thinking about the number of projects to invest in, the kinds of projects to invest in, the scale of the projects, exactly how many there will be, and so on and so forth. I mean, we're really trying to think long-term over kind of minimum a decade plus, and that's constantly kind of being renewed, this mandate. So, I mean, the engagement is still there, but depending on the flexibility, the ability to adapt the use case to specific brand needs and kind of what they're looking to communicate, that'll really determine, I think, the scale of what can be done. You know, and the more restrictive use case there is, and if it's falling more on, as I said before, kind of CSR claims, marketing claims, or contributions, I think that'll probably restrict the activity. How much, I don't really know. That's still something that has to be discussed. You know, the more flexible the claims would be, I think it would enable larger scale action. And I mean, that's pretty obvious, I think. As for exactly how that'll look in the end when the dust settles, that still has to be determined, I think.
Okay. The last audience question is for Jennifer. It's from Georgina Turner. I think it's a reference to what you were saying before about as we're seeing government finance maybe falling away based on what we're seeing happening at COP29 right now, based on the recent US election result. The question from Georgina is, how can the public be assured that private capital might be reliable and responsible enough to be leading players in a green decarbonizing future? And how can transparency be guaranteed? So can this private capital replace possibly falling government capital based on current political developments?
It's a daunting task to imagine how we might ever get to $275 trillion, if I'm honest. But that was the case in October of 2024, and it's still the case. It'll be the case next week in December of 2024. You know, this COP was the finance COP. I haven't been following the developments closely, but I haven't seen any big announcements about a giant finance deal. So it seems, you know, my own sort of skepticism about developments at COP, you know, notwithstanding, it frankly doesn't seem likely that we're going to get a big finance deal out of that meeting. Can private finance step in? Absolutely, right? I think if the way investors think about this is with respect to returns, right? And if they believe that the returns will be there, then investors will invest. We will have credits, we will have projects, and developers will build projects that have high integrity and create climate impact. What's the prerequisite for that? Demand, right? If we don't have demand for those projects, then it will be difficult for investors to make a strong case that there will be the returns that they need in order to feel comfortable about taking the risk. And to me, the Green Claims Directive is about how can we create an incentive for companies to get involved so that the demand is there, right? If the demand is there, I'll say it again, then investors will invest, right? Right now, they're not investing because they don't see the demand because of all the things we've been talking about today. So I do think it's possible. I'm not giving up, and I think we need to figure this out so that we can sort of stay. We've already blown past 1.5 degrees. Maybe we can stay to 2 degrees of warming.
Well, I want to thank all of the panelists for giving us some really interesting things to think about. I think not just about the Green Claims Directive, but about some of these larger issues, which is the note that we ended on. How about a round of applause for our excellent panelists? And thank you so much for spending your evening with us, whether you were watching online or here with us in the room. If you're here with us in the room, I invite you now outside to continue the conversation over some drinks and nibbles just outside these doors. And if you're watching us from at home, I wish you a great evening wherever you are. Take care.